should be doing. It'll be we'll go through the order of everything, so command phase, movement phase, etc. But before that, we'll start with general rules and courtesy. So,
Things you should be doing in the game before you actually play the game.
exactly, start small. So we'll start with army composition. We're not going to go into it too much because you probably need to know a bit more. And at this point, if you're just starting out, you should probably just go with what looks cool. But overall, you should have some infantry, a tank, and a leader. And that's probably where you should go. Anything else?
Stuff between toughnesses of 1 and 12 in varying ratios depending on what you're doing.
A variation is recommended. We will move now on to courtesy. Now, this is more important. So, at the start of the game, you should answer any questions about the army your opponent has, and also explain what your army does, and your opponent should sort of do the same.
Yeah, make sure that you're not gonna get to turn 3 and then, oh, my army rule actually says that now I just win the game because you forgot to do this hyper-specific thing that no one would do without that being a rule you had to work around.
The general rules are you should answer all questions truthfully and critically with a suitable level of detail.
Don't lie. Don't say, oh yes, my toughness 3 intercessor.
At the start, give your an army rundown, which is always helpful, and maybe at the start also explain any gotcha units that you've got. It's fine to have a few trap cards with some stratagems and some combinations, but if you've got a very small unit that really doesn't look that threatening, and it really is, you probably should mention that it's bad.
Things like pointing out that Space Marine Hellblasters look like intercessors and yet are one of the most reliable major damage dealers in their army faction.
It's especially important if you're a new player. You should probably be asking what's going on. Obviously, if you're like us and you've been playing the same lists and against each other now for multiple months, you're
it's less of a problem.
Yeah. You know what's going to kick your ass. Right. Another thing, it's really important before the game actually starts. So we're moving now on to deployment. Now, I've got in the notes here, just don't do an orc. Now, Henry, would you care to explain what that is?
Well, you see, what orcs do is orcs put all of their models in a big green line right up on the edge of their deployment, and then they get shot off the board because they didn't get the first turn. And then the orc player gets very sad and starts bemoaning that shooting is overpowered, etc., etc.
And then proceeds to take 2 hours to move their 120th orc boy.
Yes. Don't be like orcs. Deploy thoughtfully with a mind to what your overall game plan is going to be.
A deployment should set up your overall game plan in its entirety. You should be thinking what's going to happen from turns at least 1 to 3 and maybe even past that. A game often is actually won or lost by deployment, and if you're good enough, you can tell who's won just by the way they've deployed.
You should bear in mind that you're not guaranteed first turn, so full sending everything out in the open is a bad idea. It'll probably lose you the game, but hiding everything absolutely also isn't a great idea because you might get first turn and then you'll be forced to move out of cover or you burn your advantage.
It also depends on the army you're facing. If you're facing orcs, realistically, you can be a bit less cautious. If you're facing Tau, you should probably be way more cautious than you normally would. Look at what your army is doing, what your opponent's army is doing, and think about the balance that should be struck with that. But you do have to think you could be getting first turn or second turn and try to plan for both scenarios in your deployment.
And remember that a mistake we used to make, you can't burn deployments with reserves or transport or deep strike. It's declared before the game. Don't be like us and spend 5 minutes. I'm going to make you deploy first because I've got 7 reserves units.
Yeah, they are declared all before the deployment step, and then you'll take turns deploying them until everyone's deployed their stuff. Right, sort of covers deployment. We'll move on to the command phase now. Now, common mistakes of the command phase, and / an important thing that needs to happen. You've really got to think about the order in which things happen and what you're doing in what order, as it can affect things, as well as the command phase itself having a lot of kind of sub phases that are a bit important.
Yeah. For instance, Battle Shock should come first because it affects the ability of things to interact with the command phase.
A Battle Shock will always come before your scoring of points.
Yeah.
The order of the command phase is sort of everything happens. There's like sort of orders / your abilities that go off in the command phase. Then at the very end you have Battle Shock, and then after that, and this is always after Battle Shock, you count your primary points that you've scored, as that is important to do.
And secondary points usually aren't scored until the end of the turn, so that's not an important thing to worry about.
Now, the other thing is command point generation. You will get one every command phase. That's your turn, guaranteed. And then
abilities that often add another command point or an opportunity to gain another one that also go off in the command phase.
Now, this is where it gets a bit finicky. There is, I think is it 2 is the hard limit per turn you can generate.
You can't get more than 2 command points per turn from any source in any manner. If you have, that includes command point refunding.
A very good example is the Imperial Guard, where you have Lord Solar, who gives an extra command point in the command phase, and then the Voxcaster, which will refund a command point, so basically give you some of it back after you've done a strategy on them. Now, the issue with that is that can't happen if Lord Solar has already given you the extra command point, because you've already gained 2 command points that turn, which is the maximum. It's like a hard limit set by the game that literally can't be bypassed by, I think, anything.
No. You can spend more than that. You can kind of have more than that with things that reduce cost, but you can't ever have more than 2 command points gained every turn.
Exactly. And generally, it's a good idea to look at the order things are done in command phase. We won't cover it all here, but there are some things that are quite important.
Calling your oath of the moment and then deciding on, for instance, what ability Guilliman's going to have could be pretty significant depending on the order you do that in.
Calling the abilities and thinking about what needs to happen. Now, we'll move on to the movement phase, which is arguably the most important phase. There's a new vehicle rule out.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Vehicles can they cannot turn more than 90 degrees without forfeiting 2 inches of their movement, I believe. I didn't recall it exactly. Which means if you want to turn your tank, it moves 8 inches instead of 10, which could be quite significant.
You should think about it. Now, another thing that also falls under common courtesy, but we'll mention it in the movement phase, is don't fudge your moves. Move them 6, especially, if you're playing someone else that's new, just kind of do it properly, especially because a fudge move is one of the biggest things for cheating, is it does give you a bit of an advantage, just because the movement phase is so tactical, and it does make a difference.
Movement phase is the strategy part of the strategy game of Warhammer. Really.
It's the one where the most strategy will happen, and where you're setting yourself up for everything else that will happen in the turn, and future turns as well. You should make sure you move right. You don't want to just think about what's going to happen next phase, or even just you're running away. You should really be thinking about, are they going to be in the right place where I want them next turn, for example. You should be thinking especially about holding objectives to get primary points, because at the end of the day, whilst Warhammer, you do kill things, which is fun, it is a points game. You could
win on tabling your opponent unless you're on some very specific missions.
You could win off, I don't know, being fully tabled turn 3, but you've scored so many points that your opponent actually can't catch up, and you've won. Even though you might feel like you've lost kill-wise, you've scored the points, and that is how you win at the end of the day. A good thing for the points that I'd recommend is sort of a triangle of like objective holding. Have one in your deployment zone. You've always got one in your deployment zone in Warhammer for objectives, and then it'll be always like 3-ish in No Man's Land. There are a couple of missions where it's less, a couple where it's more, but general rule is 3. You want to be holding that objective and 2 others realistically in like a triangle that you can fortify, because you can 3 objectives will always score you the maximum primary points essentially in pretty much every single mission rule save one specific one. And it is important to hold that, and you will find that it really stacks up very quickly, especially if you make it so your opponent can't really break into that. You can
castle up and then win the game off just being able to, camp in that small area.
You can score quite heavily and concentrate your firepower quite densely while still holding an objective. Another good thing for holding an objective, and I should clarify, if you want more rules on this, Vanguard Tactics goes into a lot more detail than what I'm about to say, and I actually learnt what I'm about to say from them. So, check them out. They're infinitely better than what me and Henry can talk about.
We are not rules. Warhammer tacticians.
However, when you're holding an objective and you want to stay holding it, put multiple different profiles on that objective. An infantry unit and a tank unit is going to be a lot harder to deal with than just an infantry unit, just a tank unit, or 2 infantry units, or 2 tank units, as you've got to use multiple different things of firepower and types of damage into them to shift them off.
You also have to have, if you're contesting it with the actual contesting objectives rules, you have to have a lot more objective control to capture off infantry than a tank, but you also need a lot more firepower to shift a tank, so it means they have to commit more things to take those objectives as well. You
will have to have your opponent commit exponentially more resources to deal with those 2 factors rather than just one or the other, like combined, even if there's more of that just one. Also, you should be realistically, in preparation for the shooting phase, measuring out your shooting. Make sure you are actually in range.
Yeah, don't sprint up the board without considering your ranges and then find that all your good guns are sitting off in some bizarre field in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, you don't want to sort of
think about it.
Sprint up, go, aha, I've got you, and then realise, oh wait, nothing's in range. Or I can't actually shoot the tank, which with what I wanted.
All my units are 13 inches out of charge rate, 1 inch out of charge range. Whatever will I do?
The answer is get shot off the board.
Yes.
The advanced move also happens in the movement phase. It can be very useful, especially if there's going to be some quite inconsequential shooting. Then, realistically, what's more important is thinking about, is what they're going to do here with shooting or whatever more important than if I move them more with the advance and then they're in a more important spot next turn. Once again, it comes to thinking ahead.
Advances as well. You don't generally want to be relying on a 6-inch advance for your games. Try and make sure that it's slightly more reliable than that. It's a dice game. There are times when everything will go to pot, but you really shouldn't set yourself up for failure like that.
Yeah. Although, if you need a Hail Mary, go for it. Moving on to the shooting phase. You've pre-measured your ranges. A good strategy that you really should go for, at least I'm a big believer in it, I don't know if you are, Henry, but kill it till it's dead. I'd much rather have on the board 1 unit on full health and 1 dead unit than 2 units on half health that can then combine their shooting and just kill me outright.
Yeah, that's generally a good idea. In some cases, you can make an argument for a thing functionally being dead, but it's with the way objectives work. It merely being a unit that has objective control can be a lot more helpful to your opponent than you might imagine. That could be the
2 or 3 objective control that wins a game. Think about it like that.
Yeah. 2 units, no matter on how low health they are infinitely more helpful to your opponent than 1 unit on full health, especially whilst it's in their turn. Target priority goes with the sort of kill it till it's dead rule that I go with. However, maybe a bit less. So you've got to more so think with target priority. Maybe not what the giant big scary model is. If you've got a knight, but it's in the arse end of nowhere, like it's not actually doing anything, or it might have a limited number of shots, and if you've got 30 guys, it's turn 4, and it can only shoot 6 shots per turn. Maximum it's going to kill is 6 a turn, and you don't really need to deal with that.
When you're running heavy infantry, those 6 big shots are a non-issue, so you can focus your target priority is the things that can contest your points and keep control of the battlefield, not what you might think is the biggest threat at that time.
Try to step back and think about what is actually going to cause you issues. Maybe first turn, yeah, I can see the advantage, and you probably should be trying to kill their big models because they're going to be a problem, especially if you can't get rid of them. But later in, just think about what's really going to stop you scoring points, because once again, it's a points game at the end of the day. You should be, there could be 1 grot and an Imperial Knight. Obviously, quite a juxtaposition, not really going to happen ever, but, 1 grot and an Imperial Knight. If the grot is going to cause you to lose more points than the Imperial Knight, or is going to be more annoying, you should kill that grot. Just ignore the knight,
Don't bother with it unless it's important to your winning the game. Don't just shoot things for the hell of it.
Yeah, it's an important thing to do. Just think about what's going to actually help you in the long term. Charge phase and fight phase. We'll do charge phase first, but realistically it's the start of the fight phase, if we're being honest.
Charge phase is... I know why it's a phase, because of how rules work and how it interacts with stratagems, but it's so short that it's kind of like, step 1 of fighting.
Right. What we will do is we'll put some definitions in, because there are some definitions, specifically pile in and consolidate, that we still argue about, and although we haven't decided on definition for this now.
Hopefully they'll stay consistent when we next play games.
They won't. So, once you've charged, assuming you make that charge, you've rolled the dice, you've made it in, you have a consolidation move.
You have a pile-in move. You pile in and then you consolidate after the fighting is done.
Oh my god. Okay, right, you have a pile-in move.
Just re-record this segment, honestly.
No.
Edit it out.
No, it stays. You have a pile-in move, which after that, any units, any models in that unit that aren't in base-to-base contact with the enemy unit can move up to 3 inches to try and get into base-to-base contact, or so they can fight, with the ability to fight being you have to be in contact with at least one of your units that is in base-to-base, or be in base-to-base
with the enemy unit.
It's a weird thing, but you think of it as an extra 3 inches of movement, which can be quite helpful, especially if you're trying to tag other unit. You can tag other units with your pile-in.
That can prevent them from fighting.
You don't have to only pile into the unit you've charged. Say you've charged a unit of intercessors, and there's an impulsor maybe 2 inches away from that unit. You can just pile into the impulsor and almost completely shut it down, or be a massive inconvenience to your opponent. And you should think about that, because that can really help, even if you're missing out on maybe 1 attack into the intercessors. You've effectively shut down the tank, even with that 1 bit of kind of melee potential.
Yeah.
Now, the consolidation move, which is after either... It's basically when your model has been taken out of combat.
When the enemy unit is dead for whatever reason.
The unit could be dead, or it's more so, like you said, dead, but it is also if you've been taken out of combat. Yeah. Say, I don't know, Okay, the best example is you've killed the unit that you went into combat with. You can then consolidate up to 3 inches either into engagement range with another enemy unit or onto an objective. You must end that consolidation move on the objective with at least one of the models in that unit, or into combat with at least one of the models from that unit. You can't move closer, you have to make it in.
Yeah. For moving back into coherency, it happens much less because, generally speaking, you want to remain in unit coherency while you're fighting. It's a bad idea to be pushed out of it unless you are the one being fought at, in which case it's sometimes unavoidable.
You should have, frankly, probably just killed guys to keep yourself in that coherency.
Yeah.
Another thing can happen if, for whatever reason, the unit that was fighting has been taken out of combat. Like, it hasn't fought yet or anything like that. Even if it's not fought, you can still do a consolidation move with the same rules, so long as you can either get into engagement range
or get into
or onto an objective. To be honest, after that we go into the fight phase. Now, the important one here is the order of fighting. So, fights first is the ability that some units will just have and all charging units have got. The order is your opponent always takes the first fight. However, fights first is done as a separate, think of it as a tiered system. Fights first units, all of them on the table fight first, and then you go to regular fights.
Yeah.
If your opponent has no units that have the fights first ability in combat,
then you fight with all of your fights first units and then move to normal. But if they've got a fights first, then the opponent fights first rule takes precedence against your fights first.
Yeah.
And they fight and you undergo normal combat order.
And then obviously normal combat order is where you will variate between the two. So it will start with opponent, then you, then back to opponent, then back to you, and so forth until you fought with all units. And that will be done for the fights first units first, until all fights first units are fought. Then you go to ongoing fights, as they're called, if there are any, where there's not any fights first. And that's important. Also, just the general order of fighting can be important because of what's the stratagem called?
Close fight, things like close fights as well. Even without the stratagem, if you've got sword brethren against sword brethren, for instance, and then the other combat is assault intercessors against, I don't know, eradicators. One of those things is a fight where who goes first matters. The other one is a fight where you can probably just leave it till last.
For clarification, the sword brethren are the one where you should go first. So once again, target priority, like in the shooting phase, does come into account.
Yeah. Kill the thing that is the most likely to kill your thing if it is able to swing.
Exactly. Then done order of fighting and sort of thinking about that. So, I mean, that does sort of end it up.
That's all the rules. Yeah.
Well, not all the rules. You're obviously going to have to look at them in far more detail. This is more so just
an overview.
Generally, what should happen, and maybe a couple of mistakes here and there, and a couple of tips. If you're going to remember anything, you probably should just remember the courtesy rules. They're the most important ones by a country mile.
You've got a rule book in YouTube to learn all the other stuff, so it's very much pick it up as you go along.
Besides, at the end of the day, other than the courtesy rules, I guarantee your opponent will know all the rules that you fucked up.
Yeah,
absolutely. Because they will know exactly what it's like football, but we're not going on that tangent.
Well, I don't play football.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, right, that ends everything up. Thanks for listening, and we hope it was at least some vague help.
Remember to like and subscribe.
Shut up! No, we're not doing
Subscribe to my Patreon.
Hello, this is Editing George here. I refuse to let the video end on such a note, so I do hope it was helpful at least, or vaguely informative. Go out, have some fun playing some Warhammer. It's a good hobby, and thank you very much for listening.